Hello. Right, folks, thank you very much for that. And look, we're not going to make a habit of going over time, so I do beg your indulgence, but I felt that that was valuable. Okay. Very glad to have Richard once again with us. Rich is one of FCA's scientific advisors. He's Professor of Livestock Production Systems and Director of the Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre. He can tell you why it's called that, at the University of Melbourne, where I'm also an honorary fellow. His research is on livestock and climate change, so he's one of the guys on this. He's an advisor to various governments, the UN, and on a whole range of different issues to do with livestock, both mitigation and adaptation. He's got a wealth of scientific and direct experience with a lot of farmers. So, welcome, Richard. You're on mute, Rich. You're on mute, mate. He's on mute. Rich. Hang on.
Okay.
Hello. Yay.
Sorry. Are we there?
Yes, yes, we're there. Oh, I should just say, Rich has said to me that he wants to do this kind of conversationally. So I'll leave it to his discretion that he'll pause from time to time and allow you to jump in with questions. So feel free to do that via Slido or by the chat. Okay.
All right, I think we might be organized now. Can everyone see the screen? Great. I didn't realize that when you're using two screens, you lose control of the one screen. So the mute button was on the other screen. Hello, everyone, and thanks, Corey, for the introduction, and thank you particularly for keeping it slightly shorter than it should have been, or that it could have been. The Climate Challenges Centre, Corey, you set me up to answer that question. That was, we originally named it the Primary Industries Climate Change Centre, and then we had a change of government in Victoria, and the new minister was refused to announce a climate change centre because he was not of that political persuasion. And so over a weekend, we had to come up with something that was the same acronym, but didn't have the word climate change in it. Such is the nature of politics and climate change. Anyway, so we've worked on the area of carbon farming and carbon neutral agriculture. And I just thought what I would do here is give you a bit of the domestic, but the global policy setting. I believe Graham Anderson's already spoken to you about our 3 Ps of climate change, which I think is quite a useful framework. And so I start with that, and then I go into, okay, so what's the imperative? Why are we considering this? Then go into, well, what can we do about it? What are the options? And Corey asked me to do a little bit on the various metrics, GWP star and global warming potential. So let's see where we get to with that. All right. Still don't seem to be able to forward my own presentation. There you go. All right. So I thought I'd start with defining what carbon farming is in the first place, and then what is carbon neutrality. Carbon farming, management principles that minimize greenhouse gas emissions, maximize carbon storage, carbon sequestration in the landscape, but also, quite importantly, because this is a term that still has bipartisan support in Australia, it is not about restricting productivity. It's very much around improving production efficiency on farm while achieving these other objectives. So I think that's quite an important definition. Carbon neutral, on the other hand, is close, but management that minimizes greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, but then seeks to offset any residual unavoidable emissions by using some form of sequestration and storage. Now, carbon neutrality is really something that was brought to the forefront by the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So it's worth noting that prior to that, there was discussion about low carbon, there was discussion about carbon neutral production, but it wasn't actually a policy goal. Paris was the first time, COP21 meeting in Paris, where the global community said, we want this at a sectoral level across all economies. We want to be carbon neutral, net zero emissions by 2050. And what we are seeing is, while a lot of national governments are quite tardy in achieving or setting goals to achieve this, we are seeing subnational jurisdictions, like every state government in Australia now has a zero carbon 2050 target. The New Zealand government has a zero carbon 2050 target. A lot of American states have got, like California and the New England states, all have zero carbon targets, even though the federal government in Australia and the United States don't. But I think it's more important to note that businesses are aiming for this target. What do I mean by that? I'll come to in a moment. So what are agricultural emissions? Well, I've given you some typical profiles of emissions from either a sheep system or a beef system. If anyone's interested, we do host a number of these accounting tools. They're fairly simple spreadsheets that sit on our website. We can send you a link to those. If you've got the farm information, it'll probably take you 10 to 15 minutes to put in the information you need to figure out what does the pie chart on your farm look like. And all they do is take the federal government's national greenhouse gas inventory method and distills it down to a farm boundary, so you can actually look at what your farm is actually producing. And you'll see in Australia, methane is one of the greenhouse gases from agriculture, and about 10% of national greenhouse gas emissions are sourced from methane, largely from ruminants, but also from waste management. Nitrous oxide is only about 3% of national emissions in Australia. It comes from any source of nitrogen that is cycling in our soil. So it can be organic or inorganic, but by the time it's being used in the soil, it can be lost as nitrous oxide if it's from fertilizer, animal waste, legumes, for example. And then there are some sources of carbon dioxide. They usually are a smaller component, usually from energy use on farm, but also from lime. Lime is a fossil source of carbonate that we then dig up and land apply, and the carbonate comes off as CO2. Urea application, fertilizer production, for example. But let's not forget, agricultural land also has a strong capacity to sequester, store carbon in either soil or trees. So we need to keep that in mind and in balance. What I meant by companies starting to comply with the Paris Agreement is, I could show you 3 pages of this type of information where I've just gone into various multinational agribusiness supply chain companies and shown what their carbon neutral targets or greenhouse gas emission targets are. And this is a growing trend we've started seeing. When I showed this about 5 years ago for the first time, these were all emissions intensity targets. In other words, companies saying, we will reduce the emissions per unit of product we produce. But that's not actually, that might actually lead to more total emissions, not actually a reduction in emissions. What we've seen since the Paris Agreement is all of these companies start switching their targets to absolute emission reduction targets. So you see a trend, for example, dairy farmers in New Zealand now under pressure to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, well, because Fonterra has said we need to be carbon neutral, because Unilever said that Fonterra needs to be carbon neutral. And you can see Unilever responding to where it sees market differentiation. It's saying the future is carbon neutral, therefore we as Unilever see that our future has to be in carbon neutral supply chains. And for those of you into your beer, the one that came up last week was Heineken has now told barley malt growers in Australia that they need to be carbon neutral. They need to supply a product, carbon neutral barley malt. Fortunately, it's a bit easier than some of the livestock systems, but even your beer is headed carbon neutral. Don't mistake the CO2 in the beer, which is natural carbonation, with CO2 emissions. That's very different. And Rabobank has been in my office twice recently, head of research for Oceania, looking for options for reducing the risk of their investments, because they see investing in high emitting livestock sectors or high emitting agricultural sectors as being a big risk for the business. So a recent newsletter you would have seen come out from Rabobank is talking about carbon neutral agricultural supply chains. Now, one thing that really struck me was this statement that came out of the Financial Times. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 are companies, not countries. And I usually repeat that a few times, and I'll let you just read it again. Because what it signaled for me for the first time is we've been focused on government policy and what's government doing about greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think that's relevant to agriculture. It's the supply chain that's telling you about carbon neutrality now. It's the supply chain, it's JBS, it's Fonterra, it's Unilever, it's Nestle, it's Heineken, who are saying we will only buy carbon neutral products in the future. And that's where I think our signal is coming from. And as farmers, I think it's where you should be looking at for the signal on where your farming operation has to be. And this is why Graham Anderson and I came up with that 3 Ps for climate change framework, because this is the policy and the people side of the equation. So it actually probably doesn't matter what we think about the physical side of it. This is where the drive is coming from. And I was, interesting enough, I was sitting in the policy room in Alberta, which is where the second largest carbon offset scheme in the world is now, is in Alberta, well, the one for agriculture. And they were saying their thinking has changed, and it really changed my thinking. Because we've got this normal distribution of action on environmental issues, and we always think government should be leading the way on climate change policy, but actually government spends more time on the left-hand side of the curve, just preventing laggards from being worse, just preventing soil erosion, preventing leaching of nitrate onto the barrier reef. Whereas what we're seeing is that it's that previous page of a supply chain. It's the leading companies that are looking at market differentiation, that are looking to lead the way, that are setting the pace on where we should go with carbon neutral agriculture. So you can see a number of activities as a result of this environment. So we know Meat and Livestock Australia has come out with their CM30 initiative, saying Australian beef, red meat actually, can be carbon neutral by 2030. And there's a lot of action around that. Why did they say that? Well, because their competitors, like the state of Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil, has actually set a carbon neutral target that includes their livestock sector. And we've seen the launch in the European Union of the Brazilian carbon neutral beef brand. Now, I've been visiting them recently, and they are not strictly carbon neutral, actually, but we can talk about that. But it doesn't stop the promotion going on. In New Zealand, we've seen the zero carbon bill, and that does include the agricultural sector. Interesting, and towards the end of the talk, we can have a chat about the New Zealand carbon bill, because it sets a zero target for long-lived gases, but it doesn't set a zero target for methane, recognizing that methane is a shorter-lived gas. We can get into that later. And you can go to the IPCC report and see that they say that diet choice is part of the solution. Why do they say that? Well, that's code for saying eat less red meat. That's really what they're saying. So I would go the other way. I would say that we actually have some solutions to reduce emissions from livestock production. It's not about diet change necessarily. But if you do a quick search, this is just a quick search I did a while back on carbon neutral red meat in Australia, and you'll come up with a number of companies. I've just listed 3 here that are already offering commercial carbon neutral red meat. Now, I did follow up at least one of them and found that they were not doing anything different on farm. They were just buying offsets from a wind power station in India, for example. Now, is that appropriate and adequate? I don't know. It's at least a step in the right direction, but ultimately, you probably find that the Indian government is also claiming the reduction in emissions from that same power station. So I think we've got to be really careful about the integrity of some of these claims. And that's why we've worked with MLA to define, well, what do we mean by their CN30 strategy? What are the protocols? What's in, what's out? How do we account for it? Can we provide farmers with a simple accounting tool that allows you to figure out what your net position is? And that's what we've done. So we have that protocol and we have the accounting tool available if you're interested. Then come to the question about, well, why carbon farming? Well, my point is we talk about common efficiency metrics like nitrogen use efficiency, water use efficiency, energy efficiency. Now, nitrogen, if you're a livestock producer, nitrogen makes about 3.5% of your pasture. If you're a wheat producer, about the same, about 3.2% of the crop is nitrogen. But when we talk about carbon, half of what you're looking at as a crop, a plant, is carbon. 48% of most organic material is straight carbon. And yet we don't talk about carbon use efficiency. And here's my point is, how efficient are we? So this is the question we need to ask. How efficient are we at capturing that photosynthesis into plants in the form of some form of carbon energy stored in the plant? Then, second question, how efficient are we then at utilizing that carbon we've now captured in photosynthesis through to the next product, which might be wheat, but in the case of a livestock system, it would be how efficient are we at putting it into animal production, which is the primary product you'd be producing. So proteins, carbohydrates, whatever. 23% of a live animal is carbon. So again, it's a fairly significant conversion process we're going through. And then how efficient are we at converting whatever doesn't go into the animal to keep it stored in the soil? That's another question. And then how efficient generally is the farm at energy conversion, not just about renewable energy and fossil fuels, how efficient are we at capturing that energy? So I see emissions intensity or greenhouse gas emissions intensity as just a metric for how efficient our farming operation is in doing its primary function, which is capturing carbon. So I've produced this little infographic that I'll step you through to explain what I mean by that. So this is the livestock carbon cycle, and you'll notice here that I've got the various forms of carbon in red. All right, so please take note of that, because carbon is not carbon. And I think a lot of people miss that step, that carbon's not carbon. CO2 in the atmosphere is a form of carbon. We want to reduce that by taking it down through photosynthesis into plants. It then is captured through photosynthesis as carbohydrate, CHO. That's different, it's sugar. It's not actually CO2, it's a form of carbon, but it's stored in the plant. Yes, there is respiration going back as CO2 back to the atmosphere, but on balance, you're trapping it because you have a physical plant sitting there. Now, when we put a ruminant on that pasture, that crop, it grazes the carbohydrates, it grazes that carbon that is there. To be fair, the majority of that is just cycled straight back to the atmosphere as CO2, so that pathway there. Straight cycling back to the atmosphere as CO2. A small amount, and I stress it's a small amount because it is a very small amount of that carbon fundamentally changes from CHO and CO2 to CH4, methane. Methane is chemically very different, and it has a very high warming potential, closer to about 100 times that of CO2. Now, you've heard lower metrics than that, but the true warming potential of methane is about 100 times that of CO2, but only for 14 years, roundabout, in the atmosphere. So we want to minimize that. How do we do that? Then, obviously, the animal deposits feces, and that's another form of carbon. It's an organic form of carbon. Then the plant decays, turns over, drops some litter carbon. That's an organic form of carbon. Soils, there's soil organic carbon that the plant then lays down as we graze our pastures. They effectively pump carbon down into the soil. A small amount of that can be a dissolved organic carbon that moves with water, so you can get leaching. But whether it's by a sugar pathway or just roots breaking down, carbon is laid down by pastures into the soil. They then go into various pools, and there's no sort of strict definition. Some people have put definitions on those pools, but generally you can think of it as a sort of series of particle sizes or molecule sizes in the soil. Some carbon is very rapidly turned over and made available to plants, and some carbon goes into very slow storage forms that may take 30, 40, 50 years to turn over. There's a bit of a dilemma I think we haven't reconciled here, and that is that the whole purpose of this cycle is for that carbon to turn over rapidly in the soil with rapid soil organic microbes. The microbes actively work on it, release the CO2 back to the atmosphere, and release the nutrients that are stored in that, that organic matter. So actually for healthy soils, we want high carbon in the soil, and we want it in a very rapid turnover form so that it's releasing those nutrients back. Because for a productive pasture, for example, you can get maybe 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year out of the release of that soil organic matter. If it's all in a very slow form, well, it's not supplying that nitrogen. If it's in a faster form, it does. But let's say that in this system, if you look at that system I've got there, if we didn't have the methane, we could argue that that system was stable. It was in balance, and that's probably true. Now, the next part of the system is we obviously want to export out of that system the product. So it's carbon stored in meat, wool, and milk. It'll go out back to CO2. So you and I drink it, and within a very short space of time, we send it back to the atmosphere as CO2, and the cycle completes. Now, for carbon farming, we want those green circles. We want to maximize meat, wool, milk, the efficiency of that, not necessarily the volume. And we want to maximize the amount of carbon we leave stored in the soil as the two pools of carbon that we're interested in. We want to minimize the methane side of the equation and any other greenhouse gas emissions that are produced from our farming operation. So hopefully that sort of tells you why the focus on methane, because if we had a zero methane or low methane ruminant system, we could argue that they are pretty much in balance. Now, just a few notes on the Emissions Reduction Fund. You're probably all aware of it, the Climate Solutions Fund or the Carbon Farming Initiative. It keeps evolving its name. If you go to the Clean Energy Regulator's website, you'll see this infographic there, which gives you a summary of all the different auctions. So on the right-hand side, the bottom right-hand side, you'll see the average price of the auction process. A bit unfortunate in that the European Union price is about $35 a tonne, whereas the Australian price is averaging around $12 a tonne. But I probably just wanted to highlight the bottom left-hand corner, just to say, well, where has the action taken place in this Emissions Reduction Fund? And it's largely in the vegetation sector, landfill waste, and then to some extent agriculture and savanna burning. It is unfortunate that the areas where we probably needed most action is actually from the power stations and the transport sector and the big emitting sectors. We would have liked to have seen a lot more action there. That hopefully is where we might land up if policy gets sorted. But I've given you a quick summary of where we're at with agricultural offsets. So here's a list of the agricultural emissions methodologies, the number of projects. I've got some of them with projects, number of projects registered against them. And you can see methane from piggeries is probably your biggest one. Those are sort of very large commercial piggeries in New South Wales. There's a lot of interest, particularly in the corporate livestock sector, in the beef herd methodology. So there's some increasing, that figure might actually be even out of date by now. Not a lot of uptake in the dairy sector, not a lot of uptake in fertilizer efficiency in cotton, a lot of interest in soil carbon, but to date, only 1,900 credits issued. That's for some obvious reasons. Savanna burning, a lot of large corporates in Northern Australia and traditional landowners have taken up that as a method. And a lot of interest in the vegetation side, avoided deforestation and those methodologies. I've just summarized them. I haven't actually detailed them in a breakdown there. The 19 million is just the avoided deforestation. So the bottom figure on the left and the bottom on the right are aligned with each other. But the 44 million is the total of all the vegetation areas, just so that you know what I'm talking about. So let's move on to what can be done. Well, we have done two, in particular, carbon audits on properties, on livestock properties, deliberately looking at what is the potential and what is the net balance situation that we can identify on farms. So these are two studies that have gone through the whole science peer review process, been done with the same accounting protocols that MLA are now using. We started with a deliberately low stocked farm at Yass. It had a lot of erosion. The farmer deliberately bought it as a restoration project. So fine wool producer, very low stocked. So the methane equation was very low, but there was a significant amount of gully erosion. A lot of land care went on, a lot of natural tree regeneration, a lot of tree planting. And so what you can see on the top right there is that gradual gray line below the zero line is the greenhouse gas emissions. So they're the negative. What's above the line is the soil carbon that was restored in the slopes of the farm, the soil carbon that was restored in the gully. So when the gully erosion was blocked and the soil was allowed to recapture and replant, and then the tree restoration that took on. So you can see the carbon balance of this farm ended up strongly positive as a result of that. But you've got to remember low emissions. So then we went, I believe you've already heard from Mark Wooden, but this is Jigsaw Farms, his property. He's planted over 22%, I think, of the farm to trees, so it tends to change. But we went there deliberately to pick a high stock farm. So what's the challenge when you've got a large stocking rate, so 25 DSEs in this case, but also significant tree planting as a result of multiple objectives on his property. So there you can see the greenhouse gas emissions driving strongly down as the negative on that. You can see the trees he's planted as strongly positive. And in Mark's case, because there wasn't a lot of land restoration, it was just moving from low productive pastures to higher productive pastures. There was a certain amount of soil carbon we could account for, but not as dramatic as in the first case. But it was accounted as above the line, as you can see. The net balance. So here's the thing. This is now taking Mark's farm on a year-by-year basis. And you can see, so the first column should have a minus sign in front of it, because those are all the livestock emissions. The next column is trees, carbon stored in trees. So you can see that increasing over time as the trees grew up. But then you see those figures flatten out and they no longer are increasing. And that's this issue of diminishing returns. It is that after planting the trees, there comes a time where the trees mature and they are dropping carbon as much as they're growing carbon. And we had to account for that in our modeling. So you can actually see that in the red line on the right, where the trees got to a form of maturity and then we're actually no longer net storing new carbon. So their value as an offset was less. The soil kept increasing, as you can see through the equation. But this is the real kicker, and when it comes to carbon neutral production, is the carbon balance in the green zone ended up being carbon positive, but only between 2010 and 2017. And then unfortunately, you need more trees, or you need more soil carbon, or you need to just reduce that first column. So you start understanding why we focused on livestock methane as what can we do about that from a productive point of view. So, well, let's talk about livestock methane. We know that the factors that affect it are rumen passage rate. So how long does the fiber reside in the rumen? The longer the fiber stays in the rumen, the more time microbes have to act on the fiber and to produce methane. So that then links it into forage quality, because we know digestibility, the higher the digestibility of the forage, the faster the rate of passage. And that graph on the bottom right-hand corner is a synthesis of all the methane experiments done in Australia over a period of time, where it kind of integrates digestibility with dry matter intake, because you've got beef cattle in far north Queensland on the bottom left of that graph, and you've got dairy cattle in Gippsland on the top right of that graph. So the dairy cattle, high quality diets, high forage intake, 20 kilos of dry matter intake per day, producing 40, 50 litres of milk per day, but producing more methane per animal because they're eating more. Bottom left-hand corner, you find cattle on rangeland in North Queensland, low quality forage, eating 5 to 7 kilos of dry matter a day, less methane, all integrated. So what can we do about it? Well, most of our research says, can we change the slope of that line? Can we actually fundamentally alter that slope? And that's what we find with certain inhibitors, secondary compounds, things like tannins. fundamentally change the slope of that line. Oils in the diet, byproducts that have high fat content, change the slope. We know the pH of the rumen changes that slope as well. So what can we do now? Well, firstly, just straight management. That's why I said there was quite a lot of interest in the herd methodology, because the herd methodology just says, whatever you're doing now, if you can increase the time, decrease the time to market. In other words, if you can get your animals to market 3 weeks earlier, that's 3 weeks less they produce methane, and then they get to market, and that's a reduction in methane. So just reducing the number of unproductive animals, you'd be surprised how much that has achieved in all the case studies we've done. Improving health and fertility. One of the big projects I've got at the moment is the impact of treating worms in East Africa on reducing the methane intensity of the sheep flock. It's actually quite dramatic. Something simple as that is you just need less sheep to produce the same amount of food as a result of reducing worm burdens, for example. Forages have quite a big impact. So balancing the diet, getting the energy to protein ratio right in the diet, bringing more legumes into our pastures, into our forages. So we know, for example, Lucina desmanthus is another one that's recently become popular. Some lucernes have got tannins, vetch, lotus, all have tannins in them that have been shown, ceridella, all been shown to reduce methane. There is some work on native shrubs. If you look at Phil Vercoe's work from University of Western Australia, Eremophila, shown to reduce methane. A lot of the work I've done has looked at oils, byproducts of other industry processes, cottonseed oil, cold pressed canola oil. Then having done some work on tannins as well, we started looking for a natural byproduct that contained both oils and tannins. And that's where we found grape marc, for example, which back then, when we first started the work, it was a waste disposal problem for the wine industry. How do we get rid of this? They were putting it in landfill, they're putting it in secondary digestion. We came along with a solution that said, well, it's got oil and tannin, oil in the seeds, tannin in the grape skins, and we got about a 20 to 25% reduction in methane from dairy cows fed on the product. Unfortunately, now it's fairly much in demand. I think the feedlot industry is consuming most of it. And then there's breeding objectives. We know we can breed plants that have these secondary compounds. We can also breed animals that are more feed conversion efficient. What about the future? We've heard about the methane vaccine. That program's been going for about 20 years. Now, don't despair, because 20 years, if you think about it, from the time we knew that methane was a problem, which was only about 20 years ago, it usually takes about 15 years from research to delivery for simple things. The rumen's biology took how many billion years to evolve to a steady state, and we want to try and change it in 10 years. Good luck with that. So we are getting there. There is a methane vaccine program that started in Australia that's now actively running in New Zealand. We think that within the next 4 years, there should be a methane vaccine. Hopefully, we get a COVID one before then. Hey? Red algae, you would have heard about the seaweed, the Asparagopsis, that has a secondary compound in it. It's got a chemical in it that almost eliminates methane. I mentioned this and the 3-NOP products because those two products alone, the one I've got there of chemical inhibitors, 3-NOP and red algae, they took us from the 20% potential reduction through to the 80% potential reduction. Prior to those two products, people were saying you'll never get significant reductions in methane. They're just simply not possible. And then along came red algae and 3-NOP and said 80% is possible. And so that's given the research community a bit of insight that this can be achieved. You might have heard of 3-NOP from DSM Nutrition. It is a completely synthetic chemical, but it was designed to inhibit the last step in the methanogenesis process in the rumen of animals. And it is highly effective at doing that. And 30 peer-reviewed papers later, there is still, they've done their due diligence. They've shown that it breaks down to primary elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. It is going through registration in the EU at the moment. The only flaw with 3-NOP is it needs to be mixed into every mouthful to be maximum efficiency. Now, at the moment, it doesn't appear to have any residues in meat and milk and wool, and so it does seem to have delivered what it said it would. The one that I'm most hopeful about is what we call early life programming. There is active research on this now in Australia by a colleague of mine in CSIRO. We sort of, one of Peter Mote, who's in the bottom right, reference in the bottom right there, was the person who came up with the idea. But it's based on the idea that your and my gut microflora are a product of our environment and our upbringing. We know that, that's well established. It's now been established in ruminants that that's also the case. And then the research went on, and you can follow some research that shows that actually the methane profile or the methanogen profile of a rumen is also determined by its upbringing. And so this is personally where I have more hope for the developing world, for example, where they probably are not going to prioritize or be able to afford the expensive supplements. And that we could actually just raise ruminants low methane perpetually, and that be inheritable between generations. Just a few words on nitrous oxide before I get to the sort of GWP star. We know any form of nitrogen that goes into our system, into agricultural systems, can release as nitrous oxide. So that's why we focused on best practice for nitrogen. So rate, source, timing, placement. Some of you might have heard about the 4 R's. There's a lot of work around formulation of nitrogen fertilizer, so slower release, new novel release forms of nitrogen fertilizer. Those are all available. A lot of research still going in there to come. But actually, if you don't like the synthetics, I think that we're going to rediscover our legume history, because legumes not only have the potential to be a better balance, but they can be a slower release form of nitrogen into our agricultural systems. So we need to be cognizant of that. There is an issue with the way our ruminants graze. They will graze a pasture that's got good protein in it, well distributed, and then they have this ability to concentrate that in urine patches and drop them in very concentrated patches. So it's not surprising that that is a great inefficiency in our livestock systems. Probably the biggest tool we have to deal with that is trying to get a balance in the diet of the animal. So we're getting the energy to protein ratio, the metabolized energy to crude protein ratio in the diet, more in balance with what the animal needs. And then we find, because otherwise if one of them's out of balance, the animal exponentially excretes the surplus nitrogen into the urine. And that's where the problem comes from. Also, soil management is important here, because soil water either leaches nitrates out of the soil, or if the soils get saturated for long periods of time, you can lose nitrous oxide through denitrification. Both are non-desirable. So managing soil water better, and one of the ways is to have more aerated soils, less compacted soils, perhaps soils with slightly better organic matter profiles to allow that infiltration without and storage of water rather than drainage directly or waterlogging. Both important. Just to finish off on trees on farm, we've probably been guilty as any other group of doing a lot of modeling of, if you give up 10% of your farm to plant trees for carbon sequestration, what does the income from those trees look like from carbon as opposed to milk value or meat value? And that I've come to the conclusion that's completely the wrong equation, because we're trying to come up with a value proposition where the carbon generally is about a tenth, less than a tenth of the potential income from that same land, from either prime lambs or dairy, for example. But what it completely missed was the multiple co-benefits that you could get from these trees. So this is an area we're starting to look at now, is can we provide you as farmers a better understanding of the value proposition of, or the multiple value proposition of trees on farm. What I mean by that is salinity, biodiversity, aesthetics, shade and shelter for livestock. One study we did just on lamb survival showed that you would pay for your trees on lamb survival, but you'd never pay for them on carbon. So a modest amount of lamb survival is actually the value proposition in that case. I was sitting at a a dairy reference group the other day where one of the farmers said, oh, well, you know, on those cold, wet, southwesterly days, we put the cows in the treed paddock because we save 6 litres a day. And I thought 6 litres a day from a 400 cow unit is going to pay for the trees. So, you know, we kind of missed the point a little. So income diversification, financial resilience, timber income, you might have heard that from Mark Wooten, for example. Nutrient sink areas, this is becoming quite a live discussion in New Zealand now, where every catchment management authority has a limit on how much nitrogen fertilizer can be applied and can be loaded into catchments. It's all about dairy stocking rates. And so there's an active discussion about farmers actually either buying or owning sink land in catchments to allow them to continue to do what they were doing on the balance of the land, but the net effect on the catchment is reduced by the sink of having trees in the catchment. So another way to look at it. And then that graph on the top right is something that really woke me up a bit. It's a group from the University of Western Australia that showed that there's a capital appreciation of your land by having trees. And in their particular study, some of the larger farms that had up to 20% tree coverage were achieving a 4% price premium on sale. Something we hadn't thought of. You know, is there actually a capital appreciation? I think what's missing is how do we design these trees to achieve multiple objectives? Not just a carbon objective, but a lamb survival objective, a wind shelter, animal welfare benefits, income diversification. And I think that's where we need to spend more time. So just to wrap up this section, I think you can see, you know, farms generally and livestock properties in particular can be carbon neutral. Initially, mainly trees and soil carbon will be used as offsets, but I think you will also will have seen that we've moved from options that can reduce methane by 20% through to options that are now emerging that can do 80% plus as of next year. So I think we're in a different ball game now. So in the future, we need more options for perpetually low methane ruminants. We need to think more carefully about more benign or slower release sources of nitrogen and multiple trees for multiple objectives. Corey, I'll stop there for a moment.
Okay.
If there's anything to talk about that as opposed to...
We will, yep. I've lost track of where my things are. Oh my gosh, I've lost Slido. No, there it is. Okay, so now we've got about 20 minutes in total. So I'll ask you some rapid fire ones. Is that okay, Rich?
Okay.
So we talked about kelp supplements. So what was the percentage that was achieved in, I've heard as much as 90% in dairy systems, at least under lab conditions.
Yeah, if you look at the literature, in vivo, they've got greater than 90%. So that in vivo, you've gone and fetched some rumen fluid and you've stuck it in a test tube and you're in the laboratory. Yeah. In actual sheep, Rob Kingsley's group has achieved, I think, 83% reduction in methane. So it's pretty impressive.
But of course, with all these technical approaches, there's always the question of then how do you implement it?
Yeah. And I think there's a bit of due diligence to go still, because, you know, if you're a farmer in Longreach, do you want to spend the diesel to truck it all the way from Rockhampton to Longreach to feed to cattle to reduce methane by less than the diesel you've just spewed out? So we've got to be a little careful.
Yeah. And
but you know, the amount needed is quite small, and so the active ingredient is quite modest, and so it might be possible. But that's the kind of thing we still need to do. Yeah.
So like, there's promise, but we need to look at the whole system and including the people and how it's grown and transported and so on. Okay. Okay. Why? Okay. First question. The grazing systems products, the soil carbon, that's predominantly in high rainfall areas. Is that right or no?
Was that something I said about
the ERF? The ERF, most of those.
Yeah, look, you know, there's projects all around the whole country, and there's a protocol they have to follow, and you know, soil carbon doesn't change by dramatic amounts in short time spaces. So I think we just have to give it a few more years before we see some results come through.
Okay.
You know, you've got to remember, it's only recent that the soil carbon offset methods have been available.
That's true. Though often climate and moisture, or climate, temperature and moisture and land use?
Yeah, look, to be fair, rainfall, Australia's biggest challenge is rainfall variability, and soil carbon responds very quickly to rainfall changes. So you have a good session, a good few years, you'll get more. If you go through a drought, well, you can lose a bit. So we have to be aware of that. And one of my colleagues, Warwick Badgery, published a paper showing that 12 years of research in Western New South Wales wasn't enough to guarantee the change. After 12 years worth of measurement, the last 3 years just reversed everything they had before.
And that's a big risk.
They still can't explain it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's a big risk, but in a more hostile climate too.
Yeah. But the soil carbon credits I was talking about there is South Gippsland, well watered, good rainfall, low productive pasture that was improved with the biodiverse species, deeper rooted species. So, it had every potential.
Yeah. Okay. So why isn't grass counted in carbon calculators?
Yeah, good question. And that's what the essence of that diagram is. And I can circulate everyone a paper I wrote for the Australian Farm Policy Journal on that. So if you want to go into more detail, but essentially the grass is capturing carbon through photosynthesis. And yes, the grass grows and you have this plant sitting above ground, you have roots sitting below ground. 99% of that plant will oxidize back to CO2 within 12 months, either being consumed by a ruminant and converted back to CO2 or being converted back to the atmosphere through natural decay. So if it decays on the soil surface, so it's an argument of stocks versus flows, which we'll come to in a moment.
Okay.
Grass is not a store of carbon. The carbon it leaves in the soil is a store of carbon, but grass does not store carbon long term. Trees are a longer form of grass. So we say, well, a tree can actually live there for 100 years as a tree with carbon sitting in it. So therefore we have confidence to store carbon in a tree. The humus fraction in the soil can store carbon for 25 to 100 years. But a grass plant itself, if you had to track a grass plant, it grows and it is completely oxidized back to CO2 in 12 months. There is no stock of carbon there. There's a once-off stock of carbon, but it's not a permanent store of carbon.
It's a little bit like the fact that the most potent greenhouse gas is water vapor. But because it's constantly going in and out of the atmosphere, constantly flowing through, it just doesn't make much difference usually. Anyway, maybe putting off track. Okay, so there's a few questions about agroforestry. So capturing carbon, putting it into timber so you can sequester more.
Yeah, look, I think that's a live discussion that we should be looking at, because Brazilian carbon neutral beef, for example, what they've done is they've put fast growing eucalypts in rows into a steer finishing operation, and that's how they achieve carbon neutral beef production. So you've got these tropical pastures in a high rainfall zone, good heavy stocking rate. The animal, actually, the value proposition lay in animal welfare, because they in a very tropical hot environment, and now they've got shade in their pastures. But then they are harvesting that timber. Why I say we should have a good discussion about it is because as long as that timber is harvested and goes into some form of long-term construction, that is carbon still remaining out of the atmosphere. So if it goes into housing timber, if it goes into building, obviously if it goes into pulp and paper, it might not last out of the environment for that long. But if you've got a silver pasture system that is growing trees in rows through your livestock system, that I think is a valid offset. Depends on the fate of the trees though.
We're starting to get some other questions here. I'm going to let you continue, Rich, because there's some questions that I know you'll probably get to about methane. So the questions like, don't answer them now, but questions like, can you sequester methane? If the herd is stable, does it mean methane emissions are stable, etc.?
Yeah, just on the one about sequestering methane, not as yet. There are methanotrophs and methanogens that exist. So methanogens generate methane, methanotrophs absorb methane. So a lot of termite mounds in Northern Australia have a mix of both. In fact, some termite mounds are methanogenic and others are methanotrophic. In other words, they actually take methane out the atmosphere. It would be great if we could maximize that process. Because livestock are so distributed, even livestock in a barn, we can't capture the methane. We did some calculations that worked out the concentration of methane that is economical to capture at that scale would probably kill the animals because it's too concentrated and be too dangerous. Having said that, there is a group in the Netherlands that have produced a nose ring for cattle that is oxidizing methane. And that's pretty clever because as the animal breathes out, it goes over this oxidation surface and it turns it back to CO2. And I think that's brilliant. So we should be thinking about that.
Okay, so I'm going to let you plow on. There are quite a few questions coming through about methane, about, you know, how much is livestock, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to let you go on.
All right, just a few slides on methane metrics. So global warming metrics have been debated ever since the IPCC was first formed and UNFCCC first came up with these methods. And we have to admit there is no perfect way to compare them because we are comparing CO2, which is a long-lived gas that can be in the atmosphere for 400,000 years, and we comparing it to nitrous oxide that usually lasts about 140 years, and we're comparing it to a gas, methane, that has a high warming, but it only lasts for about 14 years. And they all get put on a 100-year basis on this global warming potential, which is where you get that GWP 100. And they have different timescales on that. Then another person published papers on global temperature change potential, trying to get a more accurate handle. And more recently, there's the GWP star metric, which I'll talk about. The whole issue revolves around stocks and flows. So you can imagine that, and that's that graph on the bottom right, which talks about if you've got a long-lived gas, like methane, like CO2, for example, then each parcel of CO2 that is evolved in the atmosphere builds on the one that was there yesterday, which builds on the one that was there the day before. And as time goes on, you get this increasing stock going on, all right? With methane, what you produce today adds on to tomorrow, up to 12 years, up to 14 years. And then what you produce after 14 years, well, the first one's gone when you produce another one. So you get this block rather than an accumulating stock of methane. And that's the difference between stocks versus flows. So the problem with methane is that it has a very high impact for that 14-year block that 1 kilogram of methane is in the atmosphere. It has about 100 times the warming potential of CO2. So this is led on to a fairly rich discussion around, you know, it depends on your policy objective, because if your policy objective is over 100 years, well, then they all flows, because CO2 is starting to oxidize, methane is starting to oxidize, they're all depleting in the atmosphere. If your policy timescale is in decades, then methane should be considered differently, because it is a flow after 14 years, it's a flow, not a stock. So really interesting discussion there. And the choice of the metric actually turns out to be more about a policy goal. So, you know, the metric may inform policy, but it doesn't determine policy. Politicians make policy based on metrics are just a way of informing them. So if your emphasis is on long-term reversing climate change is the preeminent goal, then active removal of CO2 from the atmosphere would be the first goal, and zero methane by 2050 would be a goal as well. If you want to halt climate change as a preeminent goal, just stabilize it, then zero CO2 by 2050 and declining methane by 2050 would achieve that goal. So depends on the policy goal. You want to reverse climate change, you've got to get rid of everything. If you want to stabilize climate change, well, you've got to stop CO2 to zero emissions, which means it's going to be constant in the atmosphere for the next 400 years. And methane just has to be about a 12% decline rather than zero. So sorry about the busy slide here. I should have broken it up into two parts, but let me explain what I mean by GWP STUM. So what the team tried to do here is try to model that pattern of methane release and decay. And so the important bit is to look at that equation there and don't get too lost in the equation. Just remember the first bit is 112 times methane today. All right. The second bit is 105 times methane from 20 years ago. And it's saying, well, methane today has about 100 times, 112 times the warming potential, but we've got to deduct off the methane that's now gone from that same herd 20 years ago, because that's not there anymore. But that methane had an impact, which we can't ignore, but it has less of an impact, so we deduct 105 off. That's really important when we come to some of the later slides, to keep in mind the first and the second term, because if your herd is declining, like the Australian national herd has been declining over a 20-year period, by about, all you need is about a 12% decline in the national emissions, and then you will see a zero figure come out of that. In other words, the Australian national herd on this calculation has not been warming the atmosphere over the last 20 years on that calculation. So it's a good metric to think about linking cumulative CO2 emissions with the global mean temperature response, because it's actually modeling what methane's really doing in the atmosphere. But it introduces a whole lot of global equity issues. What I mean by that is, in Australia, it looks good right now. So, you know, the Cattle Council was all very excited about it because it suggests that the Australian national herd is not actually warming the atmosphere. If you are another country where you are relying on an increase in the livestock sector, well, every new animal comes at a liability of 112 because you haven't got the animals 20 years ago to deduct off. So, you know, and also in Australia, if we then come out of drought and we go into a recovery phase of the national herd, and we see an increase in the national herd back to where we would probably like it to be, ultimately, every new animal in that, under this metric, gets 112 times without the 105 minus, if you know what I mean. So all new animals in the system get the 112 times their methane. So for a new developer developing a new livestock operation, there would be a massive overhead with this metric because every new animal gets 112 times methane. If the national herd is expanding, the other issue I think it introduces, and that is the whole developing world, where we actually are wanting to see more food security in the developing world. And one of the climate change challenges in a lot of more extensive regions of the world that are needing food security is mixed livestock cropping systems, because you need the livestock to provide the manure to grow the crops. You need the livestock to provide the drive power to plow the fields. And so those systems, we actually want to see them increase rather than decrease. So we will actually see an increase in livestock in those regions, and this metric would penalize them. And then there's obviously that, you know, the mining and fracking industry are a pretty powerful lobby group, and this would very negatively affect them as well. And unfortunately, I suspect they have more power in global lobbying than agriculture does. The other issue of this is that by saying that this accounts and deducts off the methane from 20 years ago, effectively what it does, it kind of says, well, we're not going to worry about the heat, the excess heat that methane left in the deep ocean, because for the 14 years methane was in the atmosphere, it was heating the atmosphere at 112 times that of methane, of CO2, and that heat went somewhere. And most of it went into the deep ocean, and that'll be coming out for the next 1,000 years. And this metric discounts it and says, we're not going to worry about it. On the flip side, the global warming 100 just says, well, it's 28 times methane is the CO2 equivalent over a 100-year period. So methane times 28 is what we currently accounted for in Australia. So that says, let's take a pulse of methane. If it goes into the atmosphere over 100 years, what's the heating it's going to have? And we've called it 28. If it's on a 20-year basis, it then gets something more like an 84 times. Now, this has the flip side of, it has the risk of grandfathering CO2, for example. So what I mean by that is, if you think of New Zealand having set a carbon neutral target by 2050, that means CO2 is going to increase in the atmosphere, and then by 2050 it'll stop, and it'll just be a constant stock in the atmosphere at 410 parts million, for example. Who's accounting for that 410? The GWP 100 says, well, now you've got to zero CO2 emissions, we're okay, or we're not. We've got 410 parts million when we should have 300. And no one's accounting for that under the GWP 100. So both metrics have got flaws, I guess is what I'm saying. Here's just two graphs that will show you what I mean. On the left is an ambitious mitigation scenario, which says somewhere between now and 2050, we start seriously cutting carbon dioxide emissions. So we're dragging them down, and by the end of the century, they're down at zero. We start cutting livestock emissions, methane there you see tailing off, and we level out or try to stop nitrous oxide emissions. On the right shows you what the GWP 100 metric would actually account for. So the actual global warming impact versus what the metric says. So CO2, the GWP 100 matches it fairly well. For nitrous oxide, because it's a long-lived gas, the GWP 100 does fairly well. For methane, you can see how bad it is. It says that methane is continuing as a stock in the atmosphere, which is actually not true, because methane after the 14 years is starting to decrease. So the actual warming of methane, once you start decreasing the actual methane emission, the GWP 100 no longer matches that pattern. This is what happens with GWP star. So if you just focus on that blue line on the right-hand graph, you'll see that GWP star more accurately captures what is happening with methane in the atmosphere. Now, having said all that, there's a lot of interest in GWP star. I would probably say, and my advice to Cattle Council is, it's not going to be adopted by the IPCC because the mining industry has no interest in changing. It's not going to be adopted by the IPCC because it affects food security in developing countries, and that's a core tenet that flows all the way through the Paris Agreement, is food security is preeminent. So there's good reason why it won't be adopted. But I think as livestock industries, you can bring both metrics into the picture in your communication to say, here's what we're accounted against, but this is what actually happens to methane in the atmosphere. Here are two metrics. They have different policy objectives. Let's use both, just to explain to the public that we might not be quite as bad as made out to be. So I think I've covered all of this here. If the national herd is declining, GWP star makes us look good. Actually, at the moment, it gives Australian livestock a negative emission over the last 20 years, which is kind of a false impression that it's cooled the atmosphere. No, it's just less warming than it was before. But if the national herd recovers from drought, every new animal gets 112 times methane, which isn't a great idea. And for example, I'm working with a large dairy development at the moment that wants to start the dairy development carbon neutral from the beginning. And this would be a disaster for them because actually they are establishing new animals on a new dairy, and hand on their heart want to be carbon neutral from day one, but they would never be carbon neutral under this metric. So, you know, anyway, that's probably enough on that, Corey. I don't know if that explains or makes it more confusing.
Well, it introduces the concept, and to be frank, this issue of global warming potential, of GWP star, has a lot of people confused, including me. It's taking me a long time to get my head around it too. So please, I mean, if you know the answer, great, but it's telling that story is really tricky. And in my experience, I think there is a lot of confusion out there on all sides about this. So, you know, we'll get there.
I think if you just, you know, I know that's a tricky formula, but if you just keep in mind that GWP star is basically 112 times methane today,
yep,
as one part, minus 105 times methane from 20 years ago. If you just keep that in your mind, then you know what it does.
Okay. This is why I want this. This is why I'm going to study the social sciences. Okay, okay. We're at time, but I know I don't want to be unfair to people who have scheduled. They're going. I mean, we're already at half an hour over time. But if you have any burning questions, or you can peel off, and I will make sure that if questions are asked, that you will hear the answers to them. Okay. So, yep, I will get papers to you. All right, Rich, there don't seem to be anything more coming through. I may have missed. Yep, some good comments coming through. The rest I will ask of you later. So this isn't the last you'll hear of Rich. He doesn't know it yet. But was that all right, folks? I want to give you time. Yes, we will add the questions to Padlets. Yes, all right.
Sid Plant, could I make a comment?
Go for it, Sid.
Look, I've followed this through carefully, and the stuff there that I wasn't aware of. And from time to time, I make presentations, and I like to include the science. Where do I go to teach myself how to explain that in such a way that I understand it and so does my audience? And I'm especially talking about the methane balance and also the 20-year leveling of carbon in a cattle operation. I hope that, does that make sense?
Yep, sure.
Rich, do you want to have a stab?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I'm happy for this to be made available. If it's useful to you, feel free to use it.
Yes, please.
So Corey, you can distribute it around.
Okay, yep.
At the same time, I am working with MLA on providing what we call carbon neutral leadership training, where it'll be a day and a half of training on all of this stuff that I've spoken to you about, giving you just a bit more detail behind as to how methane is generated in the rumen and why and what we can do about it. And then that same 1.5 day course takes you through all the carbon accounting, how you actually work with the calculators we've got, how to develop a carbon audit on a property and all that. We hope to have that through by the end of the year. MLA have asked me to give an internal training to them before the end of the year.
Okay, fantastic. We also have questions coming through about, well, lots of things. So but I will hold it there. And just before I thank Rich, just to let you know, Claire's going to open up the breakout rooms by state for 15 minutes. They'll be set to automatic. So if you do want to stick around and chat to each other in those groups, please avail yourself of them, and we'll just walk away and we'll see you tomorrow. They'll be automatic. So in the meantime, I know there's still a lot to do on this. This is just an introduction. There will be more. Can we please thank Richard? Yay, all the muted clapping.
Thank you, Richard. I really appreciated that.
Oh, thanks.
Good on you, Sid. Good on you. I'm glad you appreciate it. You were one of my litmus tests. Thank you very much, Rich. And I will make links available, and there'll be this is a big, complex subject, folks. So please don't be surprised if you're not getting it all right now. Thanks, Richard. Thanks again so much for all your support.
Sure, no problem. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.